Thanks very much. Thanks to all of those of you who stayed. If you're anything like me, I was awake at 5 this morning, so I'm going to try and power through this. So it's 15 minutes. It's like a lightning talk, and I'm not used to doing it under such time period, so I'm going to buzz right through this. Please hold your questions to the end. I will try and make sure that there's time for questions. The talk is titled La La Land. Who remembers the Oscars of 2017? Yeah. You kind of saw the previews. Okay, so this is what happened at the Oscars of 2017.
And the Academy Award for Best Picture.
La La Land.
Repression is the enemy of civilization. So keep dreaming, because the dreams we dream today will provide the love, the compassion, and the humanity that will narrate the stories of our lives tomorrow.
David Chazelle, we're standing on your shoulders. We lost, by the way, but you know.
I'm sorry.
No, there's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
How did that happen? That's the Oscars. That's like a multi-million dollar event. Like, how did that happen, right? They had a very, very clever, very well-designed system to ensure that hugely public mistakes, production outages, if you will, like that couldn't happen. One of the key things that they employed was this notion that we're all probably very familiar with, one of redundancy. They had 2 accountants from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Each accountant had an exact copy of all of the winning envelopes. So when Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty walked out on stage, what they got was an envelope that had already been announced as a winner. They got a duplicate envelope. And so what they announced was the winner for Best Actress, which was Emma Stone for La La Land. And because Faye Dunaway's eyesight is not great at 4.5 inches, she pulled out the first thing she could see, and that was La La Land. That's a really, really public problem. And it uses a safety system, a system that was designed to make sure that sort of thing didn't happen. And they tripped over it. And the solution that they've decided to employ for like last year's Oscars, or this recent Oscars that's about to take place, or has just taken place, the solution was, we'll now have 3 copies of all the envelopes. We'll have one for each accountant on each side of the wings of the stage, and a third one for the producer who sits in the booth managing the TV program. That way there'll be no confusion, right? That was a safety system that fit them. But that's one isolated, very public incident. That couldn't possibly happen to anybody else. Who's heard of Fermi 1? Fermi 1? You've heard of Fermi 1? Anybody else? Fermi 1 was a nuclear reactor that had a partial meltdown of its reactor core in 1966, I think it was. This is a design of the reactor. It's an interesting kind of reactor. I don't want to get into it, but basically at the bottom here you can see there's this little tiny section which is the conical flow guide. And what it does is there's coolant in here, and the flow guide was added as a safety measure to ensure that the coolant could flow into the reactor and keep the reactor cool and stop it from melting down. Guess what? This is about the size of a beer can. It's a zirconium plate that was added to the wave guide because zirconium has a very high melting point, and it was assumed for reasons of safety that if they put one of these in place, there was no way possible that the sodium coolant could ever overheat to the point where it would melt the flow guide and then prevent coolant from flowing. Of course, what happened? It detached itself from the flow guide, blocked the inlet to the coolant, and caused a partial meltdown of the reactor. It was a safety system that was added at the last minute to ensure that there was security, and they nearly lost Detroit. Finally, early in 1968, the errant metal was fished out and identified as a zirconium metal plate that was installed in the reactor as a safety measure but had broken loose. That's from the official report on the incident. So what does this have to do with people who are working in the software industry? Well, ours is a very young and nascent industry, and there are a number of industries that, if anyone's into disaster porn like I am, There are a number of industries that have had very, very, very major accidents, and there are a number of industries that have very, very, very serious safety requirements. So the airline industry, hospitals were mentioned in the earlier talk, power stations, nuclear power stations, and then of course the arts and entertainment. There's lots of places where we add safety, and generally the thinking is the more safety systems you add, the safer you are. The problem is that especially in our world, if not exclusively, but especially in our world, the more safety you add, the more complexity you add. So there's this like dogmatic view that you should monitor all the things, right? You could say you should test all the things. You could say you should observe all the things. I don't know what it is, but this meme has been around for a while. I think we've latched onto this idea that it's like a quick, jargony kind of thing to say. It's a buzzwordy kind of thing to say. But actually what we should be thinking is, monitor sufficient things to provide a meaningful response to the questions which represent your current hypothesis about how the system under observation behaves. It's really not as catchy, right? And because it's not as catchy, it's hard to forget that actually when we monitor things, we should start with a hypothesis. We should start with some basic understanding of the system and its behavior. We should start with some questions about what we should be answering about the system's behavior, and we should seek to know the system's behavior. Safety, security, testing, monitoring, observability, call it what you like, but those things are going to add complexity, and you're going to have to consider the trade-offs that are at play when you do that. If you think now about the modern sort of software ecosystem, if you think about distributed systems and Kubernetes and containerization and cloud native and all of that stuff, you could have a workload failure, you could have a network partitioning failure, you could have some kind of OS failure, you could have a security vulnerability like WannaCry or what was it, Heartbleed or anything like that that could cause an outage. But that's just one small portion of the system that you care about. That's where your production workloads are. What about everything else? What about the ecosystem in which that system lives? What about the monitoring stuff? What about the monitoring database? What about the monitoring front end? What about the alerting system? If your email server runs out of disk space, it's not going to be able to write files out to disk. So your I/O is going to fail, so your email-based alerts are not going to fire, so you're not going to get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then your boss is going to phone you at 8 o'clock in the morning when his golfing buddy tries to log on to your production website and gets a 502. Like, right? So now you have to monitor the monitoring system.
Yeah.
It just like it's down a rabbit hole. And that's just like infrastructure. What happens if the data that actually gets into the database, the monitoring database, what if that gets corrupt? We run, at Allen Gray, we run a number of Elasticsearch clusters in production. And one of the things we've seen in the past is when your shards get too big or they get out of sync or you have a node that goes down, you can have problems recovering data. And if you haven't set up your cluster correctly, admittedly, or you're not paying attention to what's going on in the logs for that cluster, you can run into a situation where it takes you sometimes days to recover the state of that cluster because you're shoveling bits of bad data around and which shard is good and which shard is bad and what can be corrupted and what can we trust and what can we not trust. Again, there's this idea of redundancy built into Elasticsearch, but with redundancy comes complexity, comes duplication. Now suddenly you have to make choices about what's okay and what's not okay and what's safe to use and what's not safe to use. Your front end could go down, so you might not actually be seeing the state of reality as you expect. You could be looking at a dashboard. I don't know who noticed the orange sign right at the beginning that said 80%. Anybody tell me what I'm supposed to do with that? 80%
Monitoring.
What? Any idea? No, right? It's meaningless. How many of you have got like wallboards or monitors or dashboards that have got some kind of color in front of you? It just sort of fades into the background. Anybody? Anybody looking at the dashboard? One or two people? So there's this idea of failure modes in software, and this is kind of the final loop in terms of safety systems, safety and security systems, and how systems in general can become complicated when we try and make them safe. I like to think of the ways in which software systems can fail as like part of these 4 quadrants. You can have like fatal and explicit failures, you can have fatal and implicit failures, you can have non-fatal implicit failures, and you can have explicit but non-fatal failures. And if you look at that, in my opinion, the implicit non-fatal failures are the hardest things to deal with. Because you've got some level of wrongness going on, you've got some kind of pathology in your system, but it's not obvious what that pathology is. And right now, in my experience with working with a number of different teams, not just at Allen Gray, but previously when I was working as a consultant, my experience is that over the last few years, there's been this rampant kind of like stampede towards more and more monitoring. Prometheus, Greylog, Elasticsearch, Kibana, Logstash, FluentD. There's all kinds of different things that you can buy. Off-the-shelf things, open source things, like cottage industry, home-built things, things that have been glued together, Franken monsters, like several different systems put together. There's this like craziness about adding more and more complexity to an already complex environment. And we seem to have forgotten that actually what we should be starting with is a question. What do I know about the system? What do I know about its behavior? What do I not know about its behavior? What questions can I ask it to learn more about its behavior? And those focused questions should be like what lead you towards the observability that you require in order to provide yourself with a sense of safety and security. You shouldn't just take Prometheus and node exporter and smack it down and go, yeah, cool, we monitor everything, like we're secure. Because at some point that's going to break, or it's going to need an update, or it's going to lie to you about the state of your system. Or your system isn't going to fail in a really clean way, and you're going to have to go in and debug it anyway. Either the system itself, or the interaction between the system and the safety system. And when you have to debug that, you better damn well know the questions that you need to ask, because if you don't, you're going to be farming. So that's my rant. I'm done. Oh, one more thing. For the completionists, 80% of an orange's weight is made up of the endocarp. The endocarp is the part of the orange that we eat, what you would call the orange segments.
Next question, answer.
Down. Yeah.
I have a question, but I don't count. You can get it to someone else. How would you say, do you have a framework or suggestion for how one can manage, like how you figure out what monitoring to add or to change as the system evolves? So as things get added or taken away, or you grow the thing, how do you make the right choices for the right kind of monitoring?
That's a great question, and part of the reason I'm giving this talk is because I actually don't have a clean answer to that. I think the best thing I've seen in the last 18 months is probably the stuff that's detailed in the Google SRE handbook. I think their approach, and I like your use of the word evolution, I think their approach to monitoring is as accepting of the idea of evolution as their approach to software development. I think the two should evolve hand in hand. I think you should be very, very rigorous about earmarking certain tests or certain monitoring systems or certain monitoring cases or alerts for deletion. Anything that's not been fired in the last quarter or anything that hasn't produced enough for a human being to react should probably be gotten rid of, unless there's a really, really good reason to keep it. So I think like having an active approach to pruning your monitoring systems and treating them like software. Like if you let software get stale, get broken window syndrome, and I think the same thing is true for security and safety systems. Yeah?
So for my own personal understanding, are you saying that there is a difference between data mining and turning data into usable knowledge that we actually understand, as opposed to just logging everything, like every status update, for example?
Exactly that. I think you can log the whole universe, but I think the utility you get out of that is not the same as having an understanding for what kinds of questions you're going to ask that data set in the first place. Maybe you're at a point where you've got a lot of stuff that you need to look at and you're not really sure what to ask just yet. But I think if that's the case, then give yourself a time box. Say like, we're going to log everything for the first quarter. Then we're going to sift through that and see what kind of meaningful information we can synthesize out of it, and then we're going to decide, okay, this we should log, and this we should log, and this we should log, and the rest we can maybe be able to turn it on if we want to. So like eDPF is a great way to turn on logging inside of the Linux kernel at will without having to reboot the box. So you can have eDPF stored on every one of your images. So if you need to, you can suddenly turn on tracing, but for the most part, you kind of leave it off, except for the things you really care about.
Sure, time for 2 more questions.
While you're finding that, would you say that the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, applies to her?
Yeah, probably.
There's your 80%.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a good number, right?
Any more questions, guys?
So why would most devs, is logging the last thing they think of, or it's always, we need to start adding more logs so that we can improve the system? What's your opinion about that, or approach, what the approach should be?
So, I can speak for myself. Because I am so close to the problem, and because I'm so close to the solution to the problem, I don't need the additional insight provided by logging when I'm writing the code. And it becomes almost naturally an afterthought. It shouldn't be, and bad professional. But the truth is, by the time I've wrapped my brain around a code problem, I understand it to the point where the utility provided by additional logging, I mean, when's the time that you see most developers add logging? The classic one is a printf statement when they can't figure out what the hell's going on in their logic branch, right? Like, that's the first instance of logging that almost ever crops up, but it's because they're trying to query the system. And that's kind of my point, is like, if you have a beautiful understanding of your system and your system is static, what the hell with monitoring? Like, why add the complexity? Like, I'm not sure that this sort of religious adherence to we have to log everything and monitor everything is apropos. I think rather it's useful when it's useful, and then do it and do it well. But don't just do it for the sake of doing it. I think that's a mistake.
Last question. Guys, afterwards you can still talk to Sven.
No, no stupid questions.
This is a really dumb question.
Okay.
So I'm getting into reading code and logs and stuff like that, which because I'm 100% a manual tester. So this is new to me. Why, when you go and read logs and stuff like that, is it not just simple plain English? Why do you need almost a degree to decipher what the hell this thing is talking about? And it takes you 10 days to figure out what. It's just a small little thing.
It's for the same reason that you can't taste bicarbonate of soda in a cake. I know that sounds like a joke, but hear me out. It's for the same reason. Like, the thing about software is it's layer upon layer upon layer of abstraction. Someone wrote a firmware library that runs on the motherboard of your machine, right? That is code. Someone then wrote a device driver that links to that firmware library. That is code that uses interfaces available in the firmware to drive your hard drive or put bits into memory, etc., etc. Someone wrote an operating system, and that's a wrapper around that like interface and abstraction. So another layer up and another layer up. By the time you get to logging, there's like 50 guys that have each had a different opinion about how to express information. And the last one comes along and goes, boo, wah, it failed. And I wish it wasn't so, because it makes me cry. But that's the reality. And so I think part of our jobs in the 21st century is accepting that we're dealing with layer upon layer abstraction. And when you accept that, then instead of being frustrated by it, you can start to have a little bit of compassion for yourself. Like, it's impossible to know everything about everything. That's insane. And B, you can start to realize that the technique it's almost archaeological. The technique for understanding is like digging down and digging down and digging down and digging down. And when you get to something interesting, and you dig around it a little bit so you get more context. And then you dig down and dig down and dig down, and then you dig around a little bit more to get context. And that's kind of the technique. Like, I use that on a daily basis when I'm debugging production systems. I use it on a daily basis when I'm trying to figure out what my 3-year-old daughter wants for tea. It's the only technique I've learned that works.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, can I just add something quickly to
Yes,
that?
yeah.
I have found a way, for me personally, that works better than the digging around.
Yeah.
Make really good friends with the developers. Taking cake if you have to, bribe them if you have to,
Yeah.
but why spend 10 days? If you're a manual tester, your skill set is in finding the faults.
Yeah.
It's not in finding the solutions. That's just my own personal opinion.
Sure.
Make friends with the developers.
Yeah.
I'll go to them and say, what the hell is this? Like, I don't understand that, and I don't think I'm expected to understand that. I think quite often we think that we're expected to understand the problem because we don't want to look dumb, but actually it's much easier to just have that conversation. It would stop me from wasting 10 minutes, never mind 10 days, to just find out what the root cause was, and then I will say, well, can you fix it, please? And then get it resolved, because that's so that's just my own personal opinion, and it works out for me.
And you know what, you're actually 100% right. In a professional context, that probably is more appropriate because, you know, my perspective is always one of like, I want to understand. But you're absolutely right. You're not paid to understand necessarily,
Yeah,
you're not
it's a
required
waste
to
of my
understand.
time.
And having that relationship is a very, very powerful thing anyway. So I totally agree with you. Yeah, it's a very valid approach.
Awesome, guys. I think that conversation and ensuing Q&A session was really actually quite lovely. You deliver an excellent metaphor and explanation, so thank you, Sven. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, everybody. If you want to give another